If you want to be a photographer and take professional looking photos, you absolutely have to understand these three things. Welcome back to my channel, one that I have dedicated to teaching you guys photography from the very basics all the way to the most advanced techniques. Let's dive into lesson 2, which is understanding exposure. There are 3 elements to understanding exposure and frankly, understanding photography altogether. Like I said before, you absolutely have to have a full grasp of these 3 elements if you want to be a photographer. So make sure you have a full grasp of this lesson before moving on to the next video. So let's talk about exposure. Having the correct exposure can absolutely make or break your photo. But what exactly is exposure? Actually, understanding exposure is pretty simple. It is the basic way of measuring whether your photograph is too dark or underexposed, too bright or overexposed, or just right. Now, there's obviously a lot of aspects that are going to come into play when it comes to the exposure of your photograph, like what camera and lens you're using, what kind of lighting you're working with, if you are using any external flashes, where you're taking the photograph. But there are 3 aspects that you can control right from your camera that's going to affect the overall exposure of your photograph. These are ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, the holy trinity of photography. Knowing how to use all 3 of these together correctly to get the right amount of light to your sensor for the right amount of time is how you guys can achieve the correct amount of exposure for every shot you take. Here's where it gets complicated. Your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed will obviously all affect your exposure. However, that's not all they do. This is where the steep learning curve comes in. Being able to balance all of these key aspects to expose your shot accordingly, all while achieving the desired look of your photograph. It's really not an easy concept to grasp, so be patient with yourself and make sure that you spend a lot of time studying and learning these aspects as well as practicing. Just a super quick note before we continue the video, please take a quick moment to just hit that thumbs up button right down below there. It helps the channel so much and I appreciate it more than I can express. I'll even pause the video so you don't miss anything important. Great, let's carry on. It's time to break down ISO, shutter speed, and aperture individually. ISO is going to affect your camera's sensitivity to the light. The higher the number, the brighter the photo. And as expected, the lower the ISO, the darker the photo. ISO is a great tool at your disposal to help you in low light situations, but it does come with a cost. Now, we're going to dive a little deeper on ISO in a future video, but I do want to show you a quick example of what effects ISO will have on your photograph. So check this out. Both of these photos were taken at the exact same time with the same equipment and all of the same settings apart from ISO or sensor sensitivity. The photo on the left has an ISO of 200 and the photo on the right has an ISO of 2500. You'll notice the photo on the left is very underexposed and the photo on the right is much better exposed. But as I said before, this comes with a cost. Let's zoom in and I'll show you what I mean. This is the photo with the better exposure, but the much higher ISO. This right here is called noise, a nasty grainy effect that happens when your ISO is set to a high value. The higher your ISO, the more noise is introduced to your photo. Like I said before, we're going to go deeper into detail about ISO and noise and how to counter that noise in a future video. But just going forward, as a general rule of thumb, try to keep your ISO as low as possible. I'm always going to start with a ISO of 100 and try to work with my shutter speed and aperture to acquire the desired look and exposure before resorting to changing my ISO any higher. Let's move on to shutter speed. You know when you take a photo and you hear that little clicking sound? That's your shutter. It's working to take your photograph. Inside every camera is a shutter, or imagine a curtain that will open and close to allow a certain amount of light through your lens to reach your sensor. The way that shutter speed is going to affect your exposure is super simple. The longer that shutter or curtain is open, the more light is going to get through. So a photo taken with a shutter speed of, for example, 1/800th of a second is going to be darker than one that's open for 30 seconds. But as I said before, shutter speed affects more than just your exposure. When your shutter is open, allowing light to travel through it, it's also going to capture every moment of movement that happens in front of the sensor. Take this photo for example. When I took this photo, my shutter was open for 20 seconds, allowing me to capture the unpredictable split second that the lightning struck. But because it was open for 20 seconds, it also captured everything that passed in front of the lens, which in this case were about 7 or 8 vehicles traveling on the highway in front of me. Now, in this case, it actually created a pretty cool trail of lights at the bottom of the photo. But having too slow of an aperture does not always have a desired effect. Take this photo, for example. Movement in front of the camera paired with shaky hands and a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second caused this photo to be unsharp, unfocused, and have a nasty blur to it. So a very simple general rule of thumb, if you're taking photos of fast-moving objects, moving people or animals, use the fastest shutter speed that your exposure is going to allow for. When taking photos by hand, as in holding your camera, try to use a shutter speed of at least 1/200th or 1/250th of a second. And if you plan on going below that, use a tripod or make sure your camera is stationary on a rock or whatever you have near you, and even use a remote if you can to take your photo. Now we're gonna come back to shutter speed because there's a lot of really cool tricks and techniques you can use with shutter speed to get some pretty cool looking photos. But for now, let's move into the final part of the exposure trinity, which is aperture. Aperture is the opening in your lens that has adjustable blades that can open and close to make the opening bigger or smaller. The basics of aperture are quite simple. The bigger your aperture is, the more open the hole is, the more light is getting through, the brighter your photo is going to be. And then on the flip, the smaller your aperture is, the smaller the hole is, the less light that's getting through, therefore the darker your photo is going to be. Now, the complicated part with reading aperture and knowing which one's bigger or smaller comes because aperture is actually read as an f-stop and an f-stop is read as a fraction. So for example, 1/2 is bigger than 1/4, and just the same, an f-stop of 2 is bigger than an f-stop of 4. It feels unnecessarily complicated, I know. Have a look at this diagram and it'll hopefully help clarify. So an f-stop of 1.6 is bigger or more open and will let more light in than an f-stop of 5.6 and f-stop of 11 and so on. Now you might have guessed aperture also affects more than your exposure. Aperture is going to affect something called your depth of field. Depth of field refers to the area in front or behind your focal point that is also in focus or sharp. There's also a lot of other aspects that are going to affect your focal length, like your sensor size, your subject distance, your focal length. But again, we're going to go into more detail with ISO, shutter speed, and aperture in future videos. But just to give you guys a basic understanding of the alternative effects that aperture is going to have on your photo, here's an example. Now, I've adjusted the settings to keep exposure relatively the same so you can really grasp how aperture affects your depth of field. The photo on the left was taken with an aperture or f-stop of 11, and the photo on the right was taken with an aperture or f-stop of 1.4. Notice how the photo on the left has much more in focus than the photo on the right. This is because the photo on the left has a much smaller or more closed off aperture than the photo on the right. Basically, the more open your aperture is, or the smaller the f-stop, the less that's gonna be in focus. And on the flip, the smaller your aperture is, or the bigger the number, the more that's going to be in focus. All right, now that you have a basic understanding of exposure and how it can be affected from your camera settings, what is the right exposure? How do you know if you've nailed it? How do you know if your photo is underexposed or overexposed? The honest truth is, it is completely relative. All of these tools are simply at your disposal to create art exactly the way that you envisioned it. The correct exposure is simply the exposure that you had desired for the end result. That is the beauty of the art of photography. Guys, don't forget I go live every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. That link is down below. We edit photos on Lightroom. We hang out. I answer your questions. It's a ton of fun. I highly recommend it. As well, if you missed last week's video, don't worry, I got you covered. It's right here. So go ahead and catch up on the lessons, and I will see you guys next time. Until then, happy shooting.